Hello, I'm Dr. Elizabeth Ablett from the Department of Sociology at the University of Warwick. This lecture is a short module that shows how sex and gender analysis can be relevant to research. In particular, we're going to focus on how gender has been used within science and what kinds of gender bias takes place in science. This presentation draws on a lecture and slides produced by Dr. Maria de Mar Pereira, also from the Sociology Department at the University of Warwick. You can find more information about Maria's research and teaching, including her teaching on MA modules at Warwick, in the final slide of this lecture. So, this lecture aims to problematise the idea that science is a neutral or objective or value-free endeavour. It will show how our ideas about both gender and science shape one another and change over time. There are many ways of thinking about gender, but perhaps one of the most significant perspectives is an intersectional approach. This means thinking about how gender interacts with other forms of social difference and inequality, things like race, class, sexuality, and disability. We'll be looking at historical and also more recent scientific practices and discourses to explore the different ways in which they've been shaped by gender assumptions, but also contributed to the legitimation and reproduction of gender inequalities. To do this, I'll be talking about 4 different areas to do with gender in science. In practice, these 4 areas are strongly linked to one another, but we're going to separate them out here for the purpose of the talk. So we'll think about the symbolic and discursive level in terms of scientific discourses and metaphors. We'll also be thinking about the scientific research process and the effects of scientific research on society, as well as the institutions and individuals involved with science. Exploring these different levels of analysis helps us to understand how micro and macro issues are linked. In other words, for example, how things like an individual's career in science might link to wider stereotypes about gender, and would address how scientific and academic hiring practices, how we interpret data, might relate to, say, what the role the media plays. Let's start by looking at some of the discourses and metaphors that are embedded in the scientific stories that get told. It's important to look at this level of analysis, but because the kinds of gendered metaphors and analogies that are available to scientists are the same ones that are available to all of us, so they shape the stories or fictions that scientists not only tell about their research, but actually influence what it is that they themselves can see within their investigations. This is a really significant point. As this quote shows, metaphors and analogies direct the investigator's attention towards some aspects of reality, but not others. So, metaphors and analogies contribute to what kinds of new information about the world get produced. Like language itself, they operate by shaping the frames of reference which all of us must use in order to navigate our way through the social world. So what's the risk here for scientific knowledge production? Well, as this quote describes, the risk is that new information is produced which might confirm certain expectations, but also limit the attention of investigators from attending to other aspects of reality, or asking other questions of their investigation that might actually challenge those expectations. What kind of examples can we use to illustrate this point then, that metaphors, language, or discourses can actually potentially close off some areas of investigation? Well, one of the most interesting examples is in relation to the stories that scientific textbooks have told about human fertilisation. Some very interesting work was carried out by a feminist sociologist, Emily Martin, who was looking at how biology textbooks described human fertilisation. What she found that there was a lot of gender stereotypes hidden within the textbooks. She argued that although students were learning about the facts around how the body worked, these facts were often described or framed in a way that was not only shaped by existing gender stereotypes, but also served to confirm those stereotypes. Things like the male sperm as being active, whereas the female egg was passive. We actually know that the egg is just as active as the sperm. It helps to select the sperm that will penetrate it, it produces an enzyme that helps the sperm to go in, and the lining of the uterus actually helps to push the sperm along. But these scientific facts got lost in the telling of a particular story around fertilisation. What she was really interested in was thinking about how science, which is often described to be value-free, neutral and objective, actually has its own forms of cultural imagery which draw on existing gender stereotypes and other stereotypes in wider society. For example, about female passivity versus male activity. But she also argued that they can serve to reinforce these stereotypes. She draws our attention to how scientific narratives had some power to naturalise existing social conventions about gender. And in covering some of the gender stereotypes that she drew our attention to in medical textbooks, she argued that what was hidden within the scientific language of biology. We learn more than just about the natural world in biology lessons, but also about cultural beliefs and practices as if they were part of nature. Not only does this risk reinforcing existing gender stereotypes and inequalities, but more fundamentally, it risks foreclosing our access to the full picture of what actually is going on in terms of human fertilisation. So the fact that the story of human fertilisation was told in such a way meant that a lot of things were going unnoticed for a long time. Perhaps a better metaphor for human fertilisation is the key and the lock. Both are active, both are needed. But as Emily Martin's research shows, this hasn't been how we've been taught biology. So something as apparently objective or value-free as human fertilisation has actually helped to reproduce some sexist stereotypes. There are other really important examples which show how the scientific knowledge we produce is shaped by ideas of gender. As with the case of human fertilisation, the issue here is not just that we reproduce sexist ideas, but that we fail to comprehend the world fully and misunderstand things because of our gendered assumptions. An example of this is how stereotypes of feminine passivity and male aggressiveness and competitiveness have also shaped analysis of the non-human animal world. They've influenced what scientists look for and make certain aspects of animal behaviour go unnoticed or under-researched. An interesting example of this can be found in the subject of evolutionary anthropology and the research that's been carried out by Dr. Zanna Clay and Dr. Frans de Waal on human beings' ancestry in relation to great ape species. They've argued that historically, scientists have been drawn to comparisons between humans and chimps, as they sought to trace the origin of human behaviours and attributes, specifically in relation to male chimps and the so-called masculine behaviours in relation to aggressiveness and competitiveness in humans. They argued that such is the focus on chimpanzees as ancestors, who seemingly confirm these ideas about aggressiveness and competitiveness as naturalised human traits, that research on our other great ape ancestors, bonobos, has been historically sidelined. It's been suggested by Frans de Waal that it is bonobos' so-called more female characteristics of cooperation and lack of aggressiveness, which are not compatible with the stories that anthropologists have liked to tell about evolution. Frans de Waal says, and I quote, "We have two ape species to compare ourselves with, and two genders that are relevant to understanding human evolution. But the entire focus has been on male chimps, which kill each other over territory and are firmly on top in the hierarchy. They provide the evolutionary story that many anthropologists prefer to hear." These kinds of research priorities and prejudices have also influenced popular culture, providing a scientific basis for the so-called true nature of men and women, and the binary between men and women, let alone non-binary people or ideas of gender as a spectrum, which is therefore used to justify essentialised and naturalised claims about gender differences. These examples illustrate the kind of cultural power that science has in our societies. It is often understood as the most reliable, authoritative, and most objective method for producing knowledge about the world. It is this perceived ability to access truth about the world and its apparent neutrality that makes science understandably much more believable than, say, a set of discourses which have a fundamentally commercial aim, things like marketing, for example. But it's also why early sociologists, for example, would have claimed the discipline as being scientific, precisely because being able to describe your discipline in this way, as one that also has access to some sort of fundamental and universal truths about the world, makes that discipline seem more legitimate and authoritative. The value that we as a society place on expert knowledge and objective truth isn't as straightforward as this, of course, as we can see with the recent ideas around post-truth or post-fact society and a distrust of experts. But for a long time, the cultural power and authority of science was assumed to be normal and natural. It's because of this cultural authority that it's important to look at how scientific knowledge plays a part in shaping broader social relations of power and equality. As Sandra Harding, a feminist epistemologist, says, whoever gets to define what counts as scientific also gets to a powerful role in shaping the picture of the world that results from scientific research. Sandra Harding and other scholars, including scientists, have argued that science does not and actually cannot provide us with an objective and transparent access to the reality of the material world. Instead, it is argued that science is a cultural system. It's also shaped by social norms, ideals and ideologies, and these change according to place and time. In other words, science is a system of knowledge production that is also contextually bound. It reflects particular worldviews, values, attitudes and priorities of those who carry out and control research, including their ideas about gender, race, sexuality and disability. Science is obviously done by people who carry around certain values and attitudes in their heads, and who don't encounter the world in a neutral way and are affected by cultural discourses about gender just as anyone is. As we can see, for example, in relation to how the medical establishment has contributed to the pathologization of intersex and trans people by seeking to impose supposedly correct intersex bodies according to a binary gender module, or control and limit the access of trans people to medical interventions. For example, as late as April 2018, 14 EU member states still required sterilisation in order for trans people to have their gender legally recognised. So we've seen how science contributes to certain ideas and discourses about gender, but what about the processes of conducting scientific research? This section of the talk focuses on what the actual practices associated with the research process and how it is that cultural norms shape those practices. We can think about this across different levels of the research process. So here we're going to talk about the choices that researchers make, like what to initially focus on, what research questions or hypotheses to pose, something which will shape the entire research process and findings. Also how we might interpret data and the effects that we have on our research participants or experiments themselves. In terms of selecting a topic, for example, in the field of human reproduction and contraception, far more research has been carried out on contraceptives for women rather than men, in line with the notion that reproduction is primarily a woman's responsibility. We can also think about the kinds of questions that get asked during the research process. As we saw with the historical lack of research into bonobos, the kind of questions that do or do not get asked in science are fundamentally not taking place in a value-free, neutral environment. They are shaped by other discourses and priorities like gender. In many sociological studies of gender, there has tended to be a focus on the gender differences between men and women rather than their similarities. In some respects, then, this reinforces a male-female dichotomy and notions of essentialised gender difference between men and women. Elsewhere, the choice of study participants is another point in the research design process where bias can become visible. Beyond contraception, most medical drug tests have actually been historically carried out on men rather than women, assuming a normal or average body to actually be a male body when deciding things like what is the correct dosage. Finally, we can think about gender bias in relation to how findings are highlighted and published, and how they become part of most widespread cultural narratives of gender difference and similarity outside of academia. Across a range of disciplines, there's a systemic publication bias where gender difference is emphasised and similarities ironed out. The results that emphasise gender difference are far more likely to be amplified by popular media. There is evidence that media reports which emphasise biological and neurological research into gender differences make us more inclined to agree with gender stereotypes, to self-stereotype ourselves, and to align our performance with those stereotypes. This leads us on to thinking about the social and political effects which scientific research can have. An interesting contemporary development has been the growth of modern neurosexism, which claims to demonstrate hardwired neurological sex differences between men and women. These studies receive considerable media coverage despite having some empirical, methodological and conceptual problems which could raise concerns about the results. This example reflects a point I made earlier about metaphors, stories or analogies confirming the status quo. One of the attractions of these kinds of explanations is that it allows us to, quote, sit back and relax with seemingly neat explanations of our social structures and personal lives. By locating the brain as the site or origin of inevitable gender differences, this research provides us with a reason to accept the status quo with a clear conscience. But whilst looking at the brain as the site of inevitable natural gender difference is a more recent development, there are certain more troubling historical precedents for research which has tried to identify and locate gender and other forms of social difference in the body as evidence of the inevitable, natural or innate inequalities amongst people. We can see from numerous examples in history the role that science has played in reifying, reproducing and legitimating social inequalities. In Victorian Britain, for example, accounts of women's psychological states were used to argue that they shouldn't be educated, vote or lead active public lives. What we now consider racist, debunked and false scientific eugenicist studies on racial difference were for a long time considered to impart some essential truth on the inherent differences between white and black people, and used as a justification for racism, much of which continues to have significant resonance today. This kind of authoritative, supposed scientific evidence made it possible for people to legitimate inequalities through colonialism, slavery or racial segregation. This shows the important links between scientific knowledge production and power and inequalities also extend to the individual protagonists and institutions of science. Many women for decades have been excluded from scientific work and scientific study societies. When they did manage to make a contribution in some way, they were often sidelined or not acknowledged. It might be easy to think of these issues as historical relics, but we can see that gender discrimination continues within contemporary scientific and academic cultures. For instance, in popular culture, men and women scientists continue to be treated differently, with men far more often cited as experts in scientific discourse than women. Beyond representations of gender, the different ways in which men and women are treated in academic or research workplaces is of concern. Even as recently as 2015, a male Nobel Prize winner described women scientists as distracting men, falling in love with them and crying when criticised. These kind of prejudices and bias really matter when it comes to assessing applicants for job roles. A recent study by Moss-Rakusin demonstrated that both men and women who recruit in science faculties are shaped by gender bias, with men candidates rated as more competent and hireable and offered a higher starting salary and more career mentoring than women candidates, who were often attributed as more likeable, with the implication that likability made them less serious. In a 2005 lecture, Harvard President Larry Summers claimed that women were naturally less talented for science than men were. Ben Bars, a trans man and neurobiologist at Stanford University, responded to this lecture by Larry Summers, describing the different treatment that he had experienced before and after transitioning. He described experiences of gender discrimination in the Massachusetts Institute of Technology prior to his transition. After solving a difficult maths problem that had stumped many of his male students, his professor said that it must have been solved for him by a boyfriend, and later on he described losing a scholarship to a man who had only one publication whilst he had 6. All of these issues contribute to what has been called the leaky pipeline effect. The term refers to the fact that as the level of seniority within scientific and academic institutions increases, the numbers of women and minority ethnic scholars at each level tends to reduce. In order to understand why this occurs, researchers have looked at some of the cultural influences, bias, and structural arrangements that we've just looked at. So what might be changing? Well, there's a number of campaigns encouraging women and girls to pursue STEM careers. Have a look at this video for an example of one of them. This video was used to launch the EU's Science It's a Girl Thing campaign, which was hoping to tackle the issue of the underrepresentation of women in science. However, the campaign used a controversial range of images that it chose to represent the portrayal of women's interests, for example being linked to stereotypically feminine interests like makeup. In response, a campaign called Science Girl launched a 2013 calendar which showcased the work of a diverse mix of female scientists from a wide range of backgrounds. Their campaign emphasised how the education system and cultural environment around science were deeply flawed. They suggested that it's only by looking at how different social spheres interact, things like the home, media representations, the workplace, in the classroom and so on, that we can actually get a clearer picture of the range of factors which prevent women getting into science and getting on once they're in it. These are barriers which in some cases have become almost so familiar that they have become invisible. It's the need to pay attention to these kind of complexities that has also been at the core of this lecture. It's a range of issues, whether that's bias within publication, individuals within science, the kinds of research questions that get asked, and the kinds of language and stories that we use that contribute to the reproduction of certain inequalities. Awareness of this complexity is the first step towards challenging these inequalities. As a further activity to support the work you've done in watching this lecture, have a think about the following question on this slide. For a subsequent activity, have a look at the three graphs at the end of this presentation and think about what is going on in relation to each of the three diagrams and how that might relate to your own experiences of science education. Thank you for listening.